Welcome back to Doc's Man Cave. We're still talking about carburetors. We'll try to get through this as quick as we can. Got a couple new motorcycles that showed up at the shop since the last time we visited. This Harley belongs to a very good friend. It sits much more than it gets ridden. And last time it was ridden, it made a little bit of a mess. There's a little bit of oil dripping down here, a little bit of oil on the back on the side cover, and it's apparently coming from the oil filter. I'm sorry, the air filter. This has got a K&N air filter on it with red oil, and the oil that's on the motorcycle has a reddish tint. And taking the cover off the air cleaner, it's pretty obvious that the air cleaner has gotten wet and it's dribbling a little bit of pink oil out. We've got to get the right light to show you here you can see the pink oil much better. Right there's where the filter is dribbling. So the reason it's here is just to investigate this light oil situation. Make sure it's not the push rod tubes leaking or a fork seal, but obviously there's nothing leaking down the fork leg. So it came here just to investigate, and I think it has to do with the fact that it's ridden very seldom. It has an accelerator pump, so when he starts it, he might be cranking the throttle a number of times and shooting fuel into it, and while you're starting it, it'll spit back. So I want to just be certain that since it's ridden almost never, I want to be certain that the carburetor is clean before I give it back to my friend. I want to make sure that it's not over full of oil, and clean the air filter and service it so it's not overly oily, and ride it and make sure it doesn't make pink oil on itself anymore. But since it's here, it's an extraordinary carburetor to use for talking about float bowls. We're going to talk about float bowls today and main circuits, and I got 3 carburetors now to play with, so it can really confuse you. One thing I wanted to show you while I'm standing here is this little deal. My mentor and motorcycle mechanic had one of these. This was made out of a 2x6. This is bought off the tool truck. For many of you, this is no big deal, but if you're a do-it-yourselfer and you've got a bunch of these socket rails, it's extraordinarily handy to put them all on one device with a handle. And if you really, really mean it, a little carpet on the bottom so you don't scratch something that you set this thing on. So when you head over to work on your motorcycle, if you don't have everything in a big roll-around toolbox, you take the majority of your sockets with you. Just thought that'd be fun to show you. And we're going to walk over here and we're going to look at 3 carburetors. The other one that showed up this week, I got to get these motorbikes back to their owners soon because my neighbors are going to come and run me out of the neighborhood for having a whole bunch of mechanic jobs in my garage. That's sort of... All right, we're going to talk about float inlets. And one of the things that I mentioned in the last video was, that you've got these fine processes where you're trying to pull fuel through jets with air bleeds and all that kind of thing, and the float level is really critical. And I mentioned that the inlet or the low speed jets were the most sensitive jets on the motorcycle. The second most frequent problem with motorcycles is the inlet system that controls the float level. So the first carburetor we talked about was a round slide Mikuni, and for some reason I used the word barrel valve to describe the slide, which is not the right word. It's a slide valve. That's why we call this the slide. But anyway, we had a round slide Mikuni. We talked about its idle circuits. Very, very common, very popular carburetor. Then the other thing that we talked about was the float, just briefly. And I mentioned that this thing had incarcerated floats. Well, that's probably not the right word to use for it, but they are independently guided floats. Now, what's kind of interesting about this carburetor is it sat for a while, and we scrape a little bit, and we're going to see some grunge coming out of this thing that will easily plug a jet. So one of the fun things about the Harley carburetor is the Harley sat parked with no alcohol 93 gas in it. No special additives in the tank, but it was no alcohol 93 and it was completely full with it. Excuse me, I got to get my magic impact. So it's going to be kind of fun to peel open the Harley carburetor and show you whether or not it benefited from sitting for a year with no alcohol 93. Okay, we're going to open this Harley carburetor. One thing I thought it'd be fun to show you is this. This is sort of a low buck cafeteria tray. I'm pretty sure that's what it was made for. When I find some more of them, I'm going to get the old-fashioned fiberglass ones with the little metal bead. You can still buy them and you can find them used. But anyway, when you're busting open a carburetor, no matter how hard you try to get all the fuel out of it, it doesn't work. There's always some fuel in it. And then when you're working on the carburetor, it's got small parts and little ball bearings and things sometimes that come out of it and go rolling across the floor. So your best option is a tray. And then as you're putting the carburetor back together, you know, you put little white rags down and lay all the clean parts out of the tray. But the lips on the tray is the magic part. The parts don't just roll off and go dancing across the floor. Okay, so this carburetor is a stock Harley Evolution 80 cubic inch, 20-year-old carburetor. It is made by a supplier to the Japanese motorcycle industry. Cayenne, I believe is the correct way you pronounce it. And Cayenne may be, I'm not sure there, I want to get sued. Cayenne might be owned by Honda. This is an extraordinarily good carburetor. Has a couple things going for it. This one has a butterfly valve for opening the throttle. The screws on the front for the idle mixture, which makes it a fuel screw, what we talked about last time. If the screw was on the back, it'd be an air screw. But anyway, you adjust the idle mixture up here. Butterfly throttle. And it's what you call a CV carburetor, constant velocity, because it's got this little system with a diaphragm and a spring to try to keep the air moving through the carburetor fast, so it pulls fuel really, really well. And as you open the butterfly and the engine's wanting more air, this little diaphragm senses what's going on and it pulls up the slide. But that's not the main topic today. Okay, so here we go. That is the inside of the bowl, and I know that this motorcycle was run maybe once every 3 months and ridden maybe once every 6 months. And I know that it was ran completely dry and filled with 93 no alcohol fuel before it got parked. And I'm reasonably certain that my pal that owns this motorcycle didn't put any crazy potions in it. When you're trying to pull this pin out that the float pivots on so that you can access all these parts, sometimes it's a little stubborn and you can get a really narrow little pin punch. Get you a little narrow pin punch and a cute little brass hammer that you made in a shop once upon a time. And you can drive the pin out this way. You want to be very careful. You don't want to beat the end of the pin up. You don't want to beat the hole up. Or this little thing is called an automatic center punch. Airplane guys use it and machinists use it to make little indents for starting drill bits. But an automatic center punch works nice too for freeing this thing up. If you have to grab a hold of this pin, you want to do it very carefully, because if you knurl the pin or knurl the middle of the pin where the float arm swings, it can get grabby. You want the pin smooth as can be, and these little posts that hold the pin are fragile. And once you break them off, you got to have a friend that's a machinist to repair the carb body, or you have to throw the carburetor away. See if I picked the right pin punch. I think I did. Now I'm going to be semi-barbaric, and I use pliers. If I had to pull hard on it, I would screw up the end of that pin. So pliers is sort of, takes a certain amount of discernment. Here's my pin. Happy, smooth, round, doesn't have a bunch of corrosion on it. That's great. Here's my float. Interesting. Here's a Cayenne float that's made out of probably nylon. It is probably made out of 2 halves that are bonded together ultrasonically. So this thing is light, cheap to make, and it floats really well. These floats, in this particular vintage Mikuni, look like plastic, and it sort of is plastic. I believe it's called nitrofill, and it's sort of like sponge plastic. It's got lots of little gaps inside of it, all interconnected so that it doesn't absorb gasoline. It floats on the gasoline. It's very lightweight. I think nitrofill floats are kind of expensive. I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly. And last week we showed you a brass float. Here's the float for a third carburetor that's here in my shop right now. This is a similar one to this one in that it's plastic. It's welded together somehow or another, probably ultrasonically welded together. Anyway, back to the Harley carburetor. You notice this little lump on the side of the bowl. This carburetor has an accelerator pump. If you fooled around with cars years ago, when cars had carburetors, this is not a foreign thing to you at all. But as you lean out the mixtures on motorcycles to get them to pass emissions, and it becomes more and more difficult to get to them to accelerate well with a lean idle setting and lean transition on the pilot and lean main jetting. So you'll see on newer carbureted motorcycles, the closer you get to the fuel injection era, the more often you'll see a little accelerator pump, and we'll talk about it some more in a minute. The gaskets on the floats vary. The nicest style are these, that it's a shaped O-ring, and it's oh, what's a good way to say this? It's engineered to not leak, and there's a certain amount of crush on the O-ring, and you can't under tighten or over tighten these screws, because when the screw gets tight, metal goes up against metal, and the amount of squeeze on that O-ring is determined by how it's designed. The reason we should talk about that is after years and years of sitting, squeezed down fully, it takes on that shape, and it may not seal when you put it back together after years of exposure to gasoline, particularly gasoline with alcohol. So when a dealership gets one of these carburetors, here's a couple things they have to think about. If they don't replace that gasket, and you go home and your motorcycle dribbles and leaks, well, then they have to do the job all over again. So they're going to replace that gasket. If you look at yours and you can see that the rubber is standing above the metal surface, you got a real good feeling that it's going to go back together without any troubles. So, you know, a keen eye and some reading glasses, and you can feel with your finger that this rubber's standing up. So this is going to work. The other thing, we're going to talk about how to clean this inlet seat. It's a well, it's a little bore with a tiny hole at the end of it, and I'll draw it here in a minute. And this little needle, when this little needle gets pushed down by the float, seals off the gasoline. You use some fuel while you're going down the road, the float drops, opens up the little needle, and we get gasoline again. If this thing doesn't seal well, when the float comes up, it dribbles out, overflows. This is an overflow. It makes a mess. It stinks up your garage. Well, it can also catch your garage on fire. So the same problem for the dealership is, do I risk cleaning the needle and the seat and saving the customer some money, because these are two of the most expensive parts of a carburetor. The needle is a pretty highly engineered little part, despite how humble it looks. And the seat has some pretty fancy machining involved in it. So oftentimes the carburetor supply, or the dealership, has to make a decision. If I put a kit in every carburetor on a 4-cylinder motorcycle, that means I buy 4 of these needle and seat assemblies. I buy 4 of these gaskets, and they're a shaped gasket, which means the tooling is expensive. This thing's expensive, this rubber gasket. So the DIY guy can feel this and say, oh, that's working. It wasn't leaking before. It feels good. I push on it with my fingernail. It still feels like rubber. He can look at this inlet needle. Same deal. This one's got a rubber tip. You push on it with this fingernail and it feels nice and soft. Puts his reading glasses on and takes a look at it and doesn't see a dent in the rubber tip where it's been pushing for too many years. That looks nice. And then there's a trick for cleaning this thing that involves Q-tips and polishing compound. Where it seals, most of the hole isn't all that critical. Once again, thank you for watching Doc's Man Cave. Stay tuned for episode 4.